Before we dive in, if you love epic tales of war, strategy, hit that subscribe and like button, turn on notifications, and join our growing legion of warriors. Now, let's begin. In the vast expanse of the Niksari Empire's capital, where towering spires of violet-hued metal stretched into the eternal night, Princess Vylara stood alone. The soft glow of the twin moons bathed her in silver light, but her thoughts were far from the beauty of Zarenth Prime. Her gaze was fixed beyond the horizon, beyond the glimmering cityscape, beyond the Imperial fleet stationed in orbit. She was looking into the past, a past where war had nearly stolen her life, a past where he had saved it. 10 years had passed since that fateful day on the battle-ravaged world of Karosthaif, but no amount of time could erase the memory. The chaos, the fire, the screams of dying soldiers. It was all burned into her mind, as if it had happened only yesterday. She had been just a noble back then, young, proud, and woefully unprepared for the true horror of war. The Niksari and the Draven had been at war for decades, and she had been sent to observe a supposed final victory. But victory had been an illusion. Her convoy had been ambushed. The Draven, a monstrous race of apex predators who thrived on conquest, had struck with ruthless precision. In mere moments, the Niksari escorts were torn apart by plasma fire, their ships reduced to burning wreckage. She had barely survived. The crash. Stunned, wounded, and trapped beneath the shattered remains of her transport, she had watched helplessly as the Draven tore through her guards. They had fought valiantly, but they were outnumbered. And then, when all hope had been lost, he had come, not a Niksari warrior, not an elite Imperial soldier. A human. He had been just one man, his armor battered, his rifle nearly spent, his movements quick and efficient. He had fought like a ghost, weaving through the chaos with terrifying precision. She never learned his name. He had never spoken of his past, never explained why he was there. He had simply fought for her, shielding her with his own body, enduring wounds that would have killed lesser beings. For 2 days, he had protected her. And then, when the Niksari reinforcements finally arrived, he had vanished. Disappeared into the ruins, leaving behind only a single worn insignia on his shoulder plate, a howling wolf. She had searched for him, begged the Imperial Council to track him down. But no records existed, no Terran military files, no known mercenary groups. With that insignia, it was as if he had never existed. And yet, she knew he was real. Because she owed him, because she remembered, and because for the first time in her life, she had felt safe. Not as a princess, not as a symbol of the Empire, but simply as a person. Now, standing beneath the cold stars, she clenched her fists. She was no longer a helpless noble. She was no longer a girl caught in the fires of war. She was Princess Vylara of the Niksari Empire. And she would find him. No matter what it took. The war chamber of the Imperial Palace was silent, except for the hum of holographic displays flickering with endless streams of data. Star charts, military records, mercenary reports. Every possible lead she could acquire had been gathered here. And yet, nothing. No trace of him. No name. No service history. No identity linked to that howling wolf insignia. It was as if the man who had saved her had never existed. Princess Vylara sat in the center of the war table, her violet eyes scanning every piece of information with an intensity that made her advisors uneasy. She barely noticed the presence of Lord Kale, her most trusted strategist. "You have spent years searching for this ghost, Your Highness," Kale said carefully, breaking the silence. "Perhaps it is time to consider that he does not wish to be found." Vylara's gaze did not waver. "I will decide when it is time to stop searching," she said firmly. Kale exhaled, rubbing his temples. "We have exhausted every official record. If he was a Terran soldier, there should be something. Deployment logs, mission reports, even casualty lists. But there is nothing. No human with that insignia has ever been listed in the Terran military archives." "Then he was not official military," she countered. "That only makes things more complicated," Kale replied. "If he was a mercenary, he could have changed identities 100 times over by now. If he was part of a rogue special operations unit, his records may have been erased. If he... Vylara's fingers tightened around the edges of the table. He was real, Kyle. Kyle studied her for a long moment before nodding. I do not doubt you, Your Highness. But we must face the possibility that he does not want to be found. Then I will give him no choice. Kale did not argue further. He had seen this determination in her before, the kind of resolve that crushed opposition like a warship plowing through asteroids. She turned back to the holographic map, scanning the outer rim territories. If he had truly erased himself, there was only one kind of place he could have gone: the lawless fringes of the galaxy, a sector beyond the reach of empires, ruled by warlords and mercenary factions. And then, for the first time in years, a lead appeared. A name. A warband known as the Red Wolves. A group of elite mercenaries rumored to be former soldiers who had abandoned their past lives. Their leader? A human with no registered name, no official history. But there was one thing that stood out in the report: his insignia. A howling wolf. Vylara's heart pounded. Could it really be him? She took a breath, steadying herself. It did not matter. She would find out soon enough. She turned to Kale. Prepare the fleet, she ordered. We leave for the outer rim at once. Kale hesitated, but then bowed. As you command, Princess. As Vylara turned back to the holographic map, she felt something she hadn't in years. Hope. She had searched for a decade. Now, for the first time, she was close. The Nixari Imperial fleet was a sight to behold. Sleek, predatory vessels lined in violet and obsidian, their energy cores glowing with ethereal blue light. At the heart of the armada was the Eclipse, the personal flagship of Princess Vylara, a vessel built for both diplomacy and war. It was a ship of regal elegance, but beneath its refined exterior lay the brutal power of a war machine capable of annihilating entire fleets. Vylara stood on the bridge, her arms folded as she gazed at the swirling vortex of hyperspace outside. The viewing panel. They were headed toward the outer rim, a lawless region beyond the reach of any single government. Here, warlords ruled, smugglers thrived, and mercenaries sold their lives for the highest bidder. If her savior still lived, this was where he would be. Lord Kale stood beside her, reading over intelligence reports as the ship sped through the void. The Red Wolves operate in the Ryvok system, he stated. They aren't a large force, but they're dangerous. Highly trained, well-equipped, and utterly ruthless. They've been involved in everything from high-profile assassinations to planetary coups. Vylara's eyes flicked toward him. And their leader? Kyle hesitated. Not much is known. He is simply called the Wolf. Her heart tightened at the name. A title. A ghost of a memory. Descriptions? She asked. Vague, Kyle admitted. Some say he's Terran. Others claim he's enhanced. Possibly cybernetic. No confirmed sightings in years. He rarely deals with anyone outside his own circle. Vylara's jaw clenched. If it was him, if he had become a mercenary warlord, then he was no longer the man she remembered. Or perhaps this was who he had always been. A warrior without a cause. A soldier who fought not for a nation, but for survival. She turned back to the viewing panel. We will change that, she murmured. Kyle sighed. If this is truly the man who saved you, we must consider the possibility that he does not wish to be found. The outer rim is a place where people disappear on purpose. Vylara's gaze remained fixed on the stars. Then we will make it impossible for him to hide. Arrival at the edge of chaos, the Ryvok system was a graveyard of forgotten wars. As the Eclipse exited hyperspace, the remnants of past battles floated in orbit, derelict cruisers, shattered defense platforms, and rusted wreckage that had been abandoned for decades. The system's primary planet, Vorkath, was little more than a wasteland, covered in endless sandstorms and dotted with scattered settlements. And yet, here, in this lawless void, the Red Wolves had built their domain. Vylara's fleet remained in high orbit, their presence an unmistakable warning. The Eclipse, however, descended into the chaos below. The planet's largest settlement, Black Hollow, was carved into the cliffs of a vast canyon. It was a hive of criminals, smugglers, and mercenaries, exactly the kind of place where ghosts could hide. Valara stepped off the ramp of her personal transport, accompanied by a squad of elite Nixari Shadow Guard, black-clad warriors who moved with the silent grace of assassins. Her royal status meant little here, but the sight of armed guards and the glint of imperial weaponry was enough to keep most threats at bay. They moved through the settlement, past rusted metal structures and neon-lit gambling dens, past traders, dealing in stolen tech and bounty hunters scanning the crowd for marks. And then, she saw it. A tattered banner hanging outside a weapons outpost. A howling wolf painted in crimson. Her heart pounded. This was it. She stepped inside, her presence commanding immediate attention. The patrons, grizzled mercenaries and scarred fighters, fell silent, their hands drifting toward concealed weapons. Behind the counter stood a hulking reptilian with cybernetic implants, his arms crossed. "You don't belong here, Nixari," he growled. Valara ignored him. Her gaze swept the room. "I am looking for the one called the Wolf." A ripple of tension passed through the mercenaries. The reptilian's gaze darkened. "Nobody looks for him." Valara stepped forward. "I am not nobody." Silence. And then, a slow, mocking chuckle from the shadows. A human figure leaned against the far wall, clad in battered armor, his face partially obscured by a hood. His voice was cold, edged with amusement. "If you're looking for the wolf," he said, "you're either here to hire him, or you're here to die." Valara's heart hammered. She took a step closer, her eyes locked onto the man's form. And then she said the words that no one in this forsaken wasteland could have expected. "I have come to repay a debt." The man stiffened. The room fell deathly silent. And for the first time in 10 years, the past and the present collided. The silence in the room felt heavier than the blaster pistols strapped to every mercenary's hip. The moment Valara spoke those words, "I have come to repay a debt," the tension shifted. No one had ever spoken to the wolf like that. The hooded man slowly straightened, his movements deliberate, calculating. His face was still obscured, but Valara could sense it, the sharpness in his posture, the coiled energy of a warrior who had seen too many battles, lost too many comrades. Her heart pounded. Could it really be him? The reptilian mercenary behind the counter snarled. "You don't just summon the wolf, Nixari. Whatever debt you think exists—" "Shut up, Ralcor," the hooded man interrupted. The reptilian flinched. The wolf stepped forward, moving with a confidence that silenced the entire room. When he finally pulled back his hood, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Valara's pulse stopped. Beneath the hood was a man who had aged far beyond his years. The face was unmistakable, sharp-jawed, scarred, but familiar. His once boyish features had hardened into something colder, more ruthless. His dark brown hair was streaked with silver at the edges, his piercing gray eyes scanning her with an unreadable expression. It was him, Ethan Cross, her savior, her ghost. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The years of separation stretched between them like an abyss. Ethan's gaze flicked over her Nixari armor, the royal insignia on her shoulder plate. His expression remained neutral, but Valara didn't miss the way his fingers flexed near the sidearm strapped to his hip. "You shouldn't have come here," he said finally, his voice rough, jaded. Valara swallowed. "And yet, here I am." The corner of his mouth twitched in something that might have once been amusement. Now, it was just a shadow of who he used to be. Ralcor growled again, frustrated by the sudden shift in dynamic. "If she's a problem, boss, we can just—" Ethan's gaze flicked toward him. "Touch her, and I'll put a hole in your skull." Silence. Ralcor tensed, then backed off, grumbling under his breath. The other mercenaries shifted uncomfortably, now realizing this woman was not just some random Nixari noble. Ethan turned back, to Valara. "You shouldn't be in a place like this. You don't belong here." Vailara's golden eyes narrowed. "And you do?" His jaw tightened. "This is my world now." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "What happened to you, Ethan?" He let out a quiet, bitter laugh. "I died. At least the man you knew did." Vailara's chest ached at the weight in his voice. She had spent years imagining their reunion, picturing it as some grand moment where she would finally express the gratitude she had never been able to voice. Instead, she had found a man who barely resembled the one who had saved her. But there was still something there, something buried beneath the years of violence and blood. "You saved my life," she said softly. Ethan exhaled, shaking his head. "That was a long time ago, Princess." She flinched at the title. He had never called her that before. "I owe you a debt, Ethan. I have spent the last decade trying to find you. Then, you wasted your time." His voice was colder now. "I'm not that man anymore." Vylara squared her shoulders. "Then tell me, who are you now?" Ethan stared at her for a long moment. Then, without a word, he turned and walked toward the exit of the bar. "Follow me." Vylara hesitated only for a moment before stepping after him, ignoring the stares of the mercenaries as she exited the building. The night air of Black Hollow was thick with smoke and neon haze, the streets alive with the chaos of criminals and bounty hunters exchanging credits and gunfire alike. Ethan led her through the twisting alleys, past rusted metal structures and shadowed figures watching from the darkness. He moved like a ghost, effortlessly navigating the underworld he now called home. Finally, they stopped in front of a hidden compound carved into the canyon walls. Security drones hovered overhead, scanning everything that moved. "This is where you live?" Vylara asked. Ethan gave a humorless smile. "I don't live. I exist." She turned to him. "Why?" Ethan exhaled, looking out over the city. "Because after that war, I had nothing left. No home, no people, just a galaxy. That didn't need me anymore." Valara's chest tightened. "You think I didn't search for you too?" she whispered. "You saved me, Ethan. You saved my people. I never forgot." His jaw clenched. "Then you should have." For the first time since she arrived, Vylara saw something flicker in his cold gray eyes. Pain, regret, and something else. Something he refused to say. But Vylara wasn't leaving without answers, and neither was he. The compound's entrance sealed behind them with a heavy metallic hiss. Inside, dim orange lighting cast long shadows across the reinforced steel walls, the place feeling less like a home and more like a fortress built for war. Weapons lined the walls, blaster rifles, kinetic grenades, even a few outlawed plasma blades. Valara's sharp golden eyes scanned the armory. "You've been preparing for something." Ethan ignored her, pulling off his long coat and tossing it onto a battered chair. Underneath, his combat gear was worn but functional, a relic of his past life. "I don't plan," he muttered. "I survive." She crossed her arms. "Survive what, exactly?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. He moved toward a console on the far wall, activating a series of holographic displays. The images flickered to life: ships, outposts, military convoys, each marked with red indicators. Vylara stepped closer. "These are Nixari fleet movements," Ethan finished, his tone flat. "I keep track of them." Her breath caught in her throat. "Why?" Ethan's gaze darkened. He tapped the screen, zooming in on a massive warship bearing the insignia of the Nixari Dominion. "Because your empire's preparing for war," he said. "And I don't trust anyone who still flies that banner." Valara's stomach twisted. "You think I don't know what to think," Ethan interrupted, his voice edged with something raw. "But I do know that the last time I fought under a flag, it got people killed. Good people." His words cut deep, like a wound that had never properly healed. Vylara exhaled slowly. "Ethan, I didn't come here to drag you back into another war." He looked at her then, really looked at her, as if searching for a lie buried beneath her words. "You were a princess," he said. "A hostage. A kid who shouldn't have been on that battlefield." Her jaw clenched. "I was more than that." He nodded. "Yeah, you were." The silence between them stretched, thick with the weight of a past neither of them had fully buried. Vylara stepped forward. "Ethan, I came because I need you, because I—" She hesitated, forcing herself to say it. "Because I owe you." Ethan's lips pressed into a thin line. "No, you don't." She took another step. Yes, I do. Something flashed across his face. Conflict. Pain. A history neither of them could rewrite. But before he could answer, an alarm blared through the compound. Ethan's entire posture changed in an instant. The mercenary in him took over. Movements. Sharp, controlled. Someone's breaching the perimeter, he muttered. His fingers flew over the console, pulling up the exterior cameras. Valara's breath hitched. The screen showed a strike team, heavily armed, clad in Nixari Black Ops armor. Ethan turned to her, his expression now unreadable. Friends of yours? Her blood ran cold. No, she whispered. They're here for me. The past had finally caught up to them. The perimeter alarms screamed through the compound, their shrill wail echoing through the steel corridors. On the holoscreen, the black-armored strike team moved with brutal efficiency, fanning out into tactical positions. They weren't here to negotiate. They were here to kill. Ethan grabbed a rifle from the wall, his hands moving with the ease of a man who had never truly left the battlefield. He tossed another weapon to Valara. Do you even remember how to use one of these, princess? Valara caught it, snapping off the safety with practiced precision. The royal hostage had died long ago. I remember, she said coldly. Ethan gave a small nod. No more questions. No more time. The compound's security system hissed to life. Plasma barriers flickered along the entry points. Sentry turrets unfolded from the walls. But Ethan wasn't fooled. They'll breach it in under 2 minutes, he muttered. They came ready. Valara's pulse pounded. We need an exit. Ethan was already moving. Back way. But they'll be expecting that too. She followed. Him down a narrow corridor lined with reinforced doors. He stopped at a weapons locker, slamming his palm against the scanner. It unlocked with a click, revealing a detonator pack. Valara frowned. Blowing up your own base? That's your plan? Ethan smirked, but there was no humor in it. I've walked away from worse. The first explosion rocked the compound. The strike team was inside. Ethan grabbed Valara's wrist and pulled her down the corridor just as a plasma bolt scorched the wall behind them. We're out of time, he growled. Valara tore free. Then we fight. Ethan stopped, staring at her for a split second. You're really not the same girl, are you? She didn't answer. Instead, she raised her rifle and fired. The first enemy dropped instantly, his armor failing to absorb. The kinetic impact. The corridor erupted into chaos as return fire streaked past them. Ethan moved like a ghost, slipping between the shadows, taking out enemies with ruthless precision. They fought their way to the hidden exit hatch, but as Ethan slammed the controls, a warning flashed across the screen. Locked. Override in progress. They're cutting us off, Valara hissed. Ethan cursed under his breath. Then we take the long way. A loud clang echoed through the halls. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, approached from the other side of the smoke-filled corridor. And then he stepped through. A towering Nixari in full black war armor. His golden eyes gleamed with cold amusement. Princess, he drawled, his voice smooth, predatory. You really thought you could run forever? Valara froze. Ethan saw her reaction, his grip tightening on his rifle. You know this guy? She swallowed. His name is Commander Rythos. Ethan's gaze darkened. Let me guess, he's the reason you're on the run? Rythos smiled. Not just her, he said. His golden eyes flicked to Ethan. You too, human. Ethan lifted his rifle. Yeah? Rythos just chuckled. You have no idea what you've stepped into, mercenary. Ethan's finger tightened. On the trigger. Then why don't you enlighten me? Rythos' smile widened. Because, Ethan Cross, you were never just some soldier. Valara's breath caught. Ethan froze. And in that moment, everything changed. The corridor was silent, save for the distant crackle of fires burning in the aftermath of the firefight. Ethan didn't lower his rifle, but his grip had tightened. Rythos's words had hit like a gunshot. Valara's pulse thundered in her ears. He knew Ethan, not just as a soldier, but as something more. What do you mean? She demanded, her voice sharp. What are you talking about? Rythos's gaze never left Ethan. Predatory, amused, patient. You really don't know, do you? The Nixari commander chuckled, shaking his head. I almost feel bad for you, princess. You spent all these years searching for him, and yet you never even knew who he was. Ethan's jaw clenched. You talk too much. Rythos smirked. Fine. Then let me put it simply. He took a step forward. Ethan didn't move. Didn't blink. But Valara could feel the tension radiating off him like heat from a dying star. Your human savior isn't just some forgotten soldier. He's the reason the Nexari Dominion fell into civil war, Valara stilled. What? Ethan didn't react, not outwardly. But Valara saw it, the flicker of something buried deep, something he had never wanted to face. Rythos continued, his voice almost mocking. You really thought the war ended because of diplomacy? Because of your people's rebellion? He shook his head. No, princess. The war ended because of a betrayal. Because a certain human assassin infiltrated the Nixari High Command and took out half of our ruling council in one night. Vailara's stomach twisted. No, that's not... Oh, it is. Rythos smiled. And your dear Ethan Cross. He wasn't just a soldier on the battlefield. He was the blade in the dark. Valara slowly turned toward Ethan. He hadn't moved. His expression was unreadable, but his silence said more than words ever could. You... Her voice was barely above a whisper. It's true? Ethan exhaled slowly. Valara, now's not the time. She took a step back. The man who had saved her as a child. The man she had spent years searching for, believing he was just a forgotten warrior. A mercenary lost in the wreckage of war. He was the reason the war had changed. You killed them, she whispered. Ethan's gaze flickered to her. I did what I had to. Rythos laughed. See? He doesn't even deny it. Ethan's focus snapped back to the commander. You done talking? Rythos smirked. Not quite. He moved fast. Faster than a man his size should have been able to. Ethan barely had time to block as Rythos's blade ignited. A Nixari plasma blade, glowing with searing violet energy. The impact sent Ethan flying backward. He crashed against the steel wall, his rifle clattering to the ground. Valara reacted instantly. She raised her weapon, firing a volley of plasma rounds. Rythos dodged them all. Predictable, he murmured. Valara lunged, swinging the rifle like a club. Rythos caught it with one hand. His golden eyes gleamed. You should have stayed hidden, princess. He twisted the weapon out of her hands and drove a brutal knee into her ribs. Valara gasped in pain, stumbling backward, just as Ethan surged forward. There was no hesitation. Ethan's dagger sliced through the air, aimed straight for Rythos's throat. At the last second, Rythos caught his wrist, their gazes locked. Soldier versus predator. Assassin versus warlord. You should have died on that battlefield, Rythos whispered. Ethan grinned. Yeah, he said. A lot of people say that. And then, with a brutal twist, he broke Rythos's grip. The dagger plunged deep. Rythos staggered, his golden eyes widening. Ethan ripped the blade free. For the first time, the Nixari commander looked surprised. You... He coughed, dark blood spilling from his lips. You... still fight like a ghost. Ethan didn't answer. Rythos took a step back. Another. His legs buckled. He fell. Silence. Ethan exhaled, running a bloodied hand through his hair. Valara stared at him. You should have told me, she whispered. Ethan wiped his blade on his sleeve. Would it have changed anything? She didn't know. Did it matter? Before she could answer, the alarms blared again. Ethan cursed. More incoming. Valara steadied herself. We need to go. Ethan looked down at Rythos's body. His lips pressed into a thin line, and then, without another word, he turned and ran. Valara followed. Behind them, the compound systems flickered. Self-destruct sequence activated. The past was burning, but the war was far from over. The underground tunnel rumbled, dust and debris shaking loose from the ceiling as the compound's self-destruct sequence counted down. Ethan and Valara ran, their boots pounding against the metal floor. 10 seconds left before the entire facility turned into molten slag. The exit hatch loomed ahead. A heavy blast door. Still locked. Ethan skidded to a halt, pulling out a small device. This better work, Valara's heart pounded. 5 seconds. She turned, her instincts screaming. A last squad of enemy soldiers rounded the corner. Ethan! He didn't look up. Almost there. Valara didn't hesitate. She grabbed a fallen plasma rifle and opened fire. 3 seconds. The first enemy dropped. The second charged through the gunfire, armor absorbing the shots. 2 seconds, Ethan growled. Come on, you bastard. 1 second. The door slid open. Go! Valara turned and dived through the hatch. Ethan followed. The explosion roared behind them, a wall of fire and concussive force ripping through the tunnel. They hit the ground hard, rolling down a steep incline, just as the fireball erupted from the tunnel entrance behind them. Silence. Then, the cold night air. Valara groaned, pushing herself up from the dirt. They had made it. Barely. Ethan sat up slowly, rubbing the back of his head. Well, that sucked. She let out a weak laugh, shaking her head. You're impossible. He grinned, but it faded quickly. They weren't safe yet. Ethan turned, his gaze upward, scanning the sky. His jaw tightened. Valara followed his gaze, and her breath caught. Ships, sleek, predatory Nixari warships, their dark hulls gleaming against the starlit sky, waiting, watching. She clenched her fists. They're still hunting us. Ethan exhaled slowly. Yeah, and now they know we're not just running. Valara looked at him. He wasn't the same man she had idolized as a child. He wasn't just her savior anymore. He was something more. You never really left the war, did you? She asked. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Then, he shook his head. No, he admitted. And neither did you. Valara's fingers curled around the rifle in her hands. She thought about everything. She had learned, everything she had lost. She had spent years searching for Ethan Cross. Now, standing beside him in the cold night air, the warships overhead casting shadows on the ground, she realized she had found herself instead. A comm unit on Ethan's wrist beeped. He tapped it. A voice crackled through. Cross, we've got movement. You're not alone out there. Valara frowned. Who is that? Ethan smirked. Friends. She raised an eyebrow. You have friends? He chuckled. Well, I have a crew. The sound of engines roared above them. Not Nixari ships, but human ones, sleek, fast, and armed. To the teeth. Valara stared in shock as a mid-sized gunship swooped low, its side doors sliding open. A burly human with cybernetic arms waved from the cockpit. Get in, Cross, before those Nixari start blasting us out of the sky. Ethan turned to Valara. You coming? She hesitated. For years she had been running, searching, surviving. Now she had a choice. She could disappear again, fade into the shadows, or she could fight. Valara took a deep breath, and then she grabbed Ethan's outstretched hand. He pulled her into the ship just as the engines roared to life. The ramp sealed shut behind them. The pilot gunned the throttle, and they shot into the sky. The Nixari ships reacted instantly, their weapons charging up. Ethan smirked, strapping himself into the seat beside Valara. Hold on. The gunship twisted through the air, dodging the first salvo. The turrets on its wings came to life, returning fire in a blazing counterattack. Valara grinned. For the first time in years, she wasn't running. She was ready to fight. And this time, the Nixari weren't hunting her. She was hunting them.